Part 2 of Fluid Electrolyte and Acid-Base Studies on page 992. And we have a bar graph here. The bar graph is depicting things that are red in the blood, blue in the interstitial fluid outside the blood but not inside the cell, and then finally inside the cell, the intracellular fluid. So distinguish between interstitial fluid outside the cell but not in the blood, and then inside the cell, intracellular fluid. We're looking at these ions. The positively charged ones are cations. The negatively charged ions are anions, A-N-I-O-N. It's easy to remember it that way because a negatively charged ion, An ion, is an anion. So here we have the major cation in, first of all, the blood and the interstitial fluid is sodium. Notice that there is not much sodium inside the cell. Then outside the cell, in the blood and the interstitial fluid, we don't have very much potassium. But because we've had a pump which exchanges these ions, we have lots of potassium inside the cell. So the principal cation inside the cell, potassium. The principal cation outside the cell, both in the blood and interstitial fluid, is sodium. Okay, and then we look for negatively charged ions, anions, and we'll note that the chloride that would normally go with sodium is going to be a component of the extracellular fluid in the blood. Okay, so not much inside the cell. And the same with bicarb. Bicarb is something, actually CO2 is something that the cell exhales, as it were. And it's a waste product of cellular metabolism, and so it ends up outside the cell and gets picked up by the venous blood. So it's in the blood, it's in the interstitial fluid, and it's there as a waste product of cellular metabolism. Here we're inside the cell, and we have hydrogen phosphate, okay, which is a conjugate of dihydrogen phosphate, the conjugate base, as it were. Okay, then these other items here, there's actually more protein out in the intracellular fluid of the cell, inside the cell. There's also a lot of protein inside the bloodstream, not so much. So water can be moving down its tonic gradient either into the cell or into the blood. So water can move very readily outside, how shall I say, move away from the interstitial fluid because of the tonicities of protein available for it. Okay, then we press on and we take a look at just in the gross setting, although there are some other things going on here, but there's where do we get water from? Well, we drink beverages, of course, which is presumably where we get a lot of water. We might eat foods that are either rich or not rich in water, foods that are processed, like potato chips, or foods that are mostly animal protein, have very little in the way of water content. So water content is to be found in fruits and vegetables. There's also a certain amount of water that is produced by what's called the waters of metabolism. So whenever you break down carbohydrate for energy, any kind of carbohydrate, from glycogen to glucose to any carbohydrate whatsoever, we're going to be metabolizing all the way, well, it can't be fructose. Fructose ends up as fat. It doesn't end up as energy. So an important detail that we've just recently learned for, how shall I say, our sense of reality over at the University of California, San Francisco Medical Center, has pretty much established that fructose is a very dangerous item. Well, at least as dangerous as ethyl alcohol. So at any rate, glucose, when it breaks down completely, is going to be giving us energy, CO2, and water. And we'll take a look at that in a little bit later in this chapter. Okay, so that's where we're getting our water from. And and I should say that because we're making so much ATP in the Krebs cycle in the mitochondria, it's the oxygen that's utilized by the mitochondria that grabs that hydrogen that is the coupling ion between the Krebs cycle and the phosphorylation mechanism of oxidative phosphorylation. The oxygen then picks up the hydrogen and becomes water. That's the waters of metabolism. It's very poetic. Okay, then what about the if you're in a how shall I say, in a normal setting? Of course, you drink water or you eat foods like fruits that are rich in water. Then you express the excess of that as urine, assuming that you've had more than you need. And then there's going to be other ways in which the water leaves the body. If you're in a desert setting, it's possible that the less will go to urine and more actually might go to what's called the, either insensible water loss, you're not aware of it, through the skin because the evaporation is so rapid, or you are aware of it because you're perspiring. If you're in a more humid climate, you notice the perspiration. If you're in a desert setting, it's insensible. And of course, if you're the public speaker, you'll need to have a glass of water close at hand because there is a lot of water loss through speaking. Okay, hopefully we have well-formed feces, and a certain amount of water is a part of that program. The last 4 or 5% of water that comes from ingested foods. Okay, then they're going over here in this little table here, this little graphic illustration in which we have what's called increased or extracellular fluid osmolality increases, or it could be the decrease in plasma volume. Okay, so an increase in osmolality means that something is becoming more tonic, right? So if you store your vegetables in water, they stay nice and firm and crisp. If you store them in some sort of very salty salad dressing, they're going to go limp on you fairly soon. Okay, so basically this increased osmolality or dry mouth could be a decrease in saliva, at least in comparison to the amount of water available to produce saliva. And we have osmoreceptors in the hypothalamus that basically help us create set points for water needs, although ours are very insensitive compared to other mammalian species that are exquisitely sensitive, like the household dog or cat are pretty close to ideal in terms of that. If we have a dry mouth, we're already very low on water to actually experience something as a dry mouth. Okay, then we have thirst. We have a thirst center. They depict a woman here having a drink of water, which would be stimulated by this experience because of the set points of the hypothalamic nuclei. And then we have the sensation of thirst, and we seek water. And we have a feedback system with regard to that. And then over here, we have plasma volume, and basically due to perspiration or the metabolism and lack of water replenishment, we might have a decrease in blood volume. Okay, and so there's going to be the release of angiotensin, which will activate many systems. Okay,